Dennis thought this would be like any other day, but he couldn't have been more wrong. When he and his children stumbled across a weird-looking bush, he remembered his time in the army. What he saw was well in line with the training he received. How this was hidden from view reminded him of Black Ops personnel trying to hide incriminating evidence. His children wanted to explore, but Dennis was unsure. When he realized what he was looking at, he wished his children never went inside the forest. A chill ran down his spine. This feeling was all too familiar for him, and every inch of his being wants him to just turn around and run away. After realizing what Dennis was looking at, he ordered his kids to stay back. This is no place for kids, or for people in general. He measured up the object hidden from view. It was a logistics truck for transporting personnel and supplies. The truck he was looking at looked old. It looked like the one he used to drive back when he was in the army. How did it end up all the way into this forest? Finally, Uncle Eddie arrived. He tried to drive his truck as deep into the forest as possible. He wondered what was so important that it couldn't wait a second. But after seeing that specific truck, he knew that this was serious. What was so special about this truck? And what was hiding behind the cracked glass? For stories like these, it is important to have a bit of context. Let us tell you how Dennis got into this situation in the first place. Dennis lived on a big farm with a lot of land. He lived with his wife, Amber, and twin kids, Sophie and Jake. The twins loved to roam around the acres and explore everything. Jake loved to climb the trees, and Sophie loved to look for flowers and mushrooms. Their day started as usual. That is, as usual as days without finding an abandoned piece of military equipment go. Jake and Sophie had breakfast with their parents. Dennis then went and cared for their cows, while Amber went into town to get some groceries. The twins, full from their breakfast of homegrown produce and meat, Jake suggested searching for a piece of the forest they had never seen before, but Sophie was unsure. But she didn't want to be left behind by her twin, so Sophie went along anyway. She followed Jake into the forest behind the farm, somewhere they'd never been allowed before. They walked along the main path and past the spots they had already seen with their dad. In contrast to Sophie's apprehension about going on a hike like this, Jake walked at a fast pace. He was always eager to discover new things. He wants to be an explorer when he grows up, traveling the world and seeing new things every day. Compared to his twin sister, who was more cautious, Dave was a loose cannon. He hated being bored. Dennis had a huge property, with plains, a hill, and a forest. It was massive. For the twins, however, the forest was their favorite spot. Sophie and Jake finally reached the last spot they'd been to. They always marked the trees so they won't get lost. Sophie was a smart child. Her obsession with mushrooms have not been just for show. She actively read up on mushrooms and learned everything she can about them. The leaves have started to fall, so it's the perfect time for mushrooms to grow. She spots a trail and decides to follow it. Jake, on the other hand, saw a large tree near a big puddle. He jumped over it, almost falling in, and started to climb up the tree. Upon reaching the top, Jake surveyed the area to see where they've been. But they are too far into the forest. "Sophie, Sophie, look how high I am!" Jake shouts, but she doesn't respond. He searches the ground but can't find her. "I need to find Sophie," Jake says to himself, rubbing his eyes. Where could she have gone? Mike and Pike think alike. His mother told them the other day. Twins always think of the same thing. His mother wanted to tell him. If he could just get inside Sophie's mind. Sophie didn't realize how far she had followed the trail. She looked over her shoulder, expecting to see Jake creeping up behind her, but she saw only trees. Oh, and a bush of blackberries. They looked so delectable, just hanging in their bush, ready to be picked. The thought of eating these blackberries was enough to get her stomach growling. She noticed how hungry she was. "I'm sure I can eat these," she thought, plucking a handful. Finally, she could see the end of the mushroom trail and decided to wait for Jake there. Dennis looks out the window. He is worried about Jake and Sophie. They should be home by now. At least, they would be if they followed his instructions. It was then that his wife, Amber, came home and looked at the worried face of her husband. This was unusual. She rarely sees her husband looking this distressed. Dennis made up an excuse to go outside and started to search for Jake and Sophie. He knew they always marked the trees, so it wasn't difficult to find them, he thought. But he was wrong. The marked trees stopped, and he had no idea where they could have gone. Left? Right? He started shouting for them, but got no reply. He noticed the trail. Could they have followed it? But he hasn't maintained this part of the trail in a while. He noticed a big tree. That is something Jake would like. He knows that Jake was a pro at climbing trees and would clamber up the tallest one he could find regularly, just to show off. Could they have gone through this area? Twins have a special connection, Jake tells himself. I will find her. Suddenly, he sees a big circle of mushrooms. He runs towards the circle of mushrooms, hoping to find his sister sitting in the middle, but she isn't there. His stomach starts to turn. Sophie would want to see this, so why isn't she here? Jake has truly started to worry about his sister. Dad is gonna kill them. Dennis had walked over to the mushroom trail and started to follow it. Suddenly, he heard someone calling. Sophie, Sophie, where are you? It sounded like Jake's voice. Jake? Dennis called back. Dad? Jake responded. What are you doing here? Jake spotted his father and ran towards him. It was the most relief he's ever felt in his life. He jumped in his arms and said, I lost Sophie, Dad. I'm scared. Don't worry, Jake, we will find her. A scream. Sophie, Jake whispered, grabbing his dad's hand. He saw a shocked look on his dad's face. They heard someone running but couldn't make out the direction. Then, out of nowhere, Sophie jumped up behind them with a face as white as a ghost. Jake, she screamed. She ran into his arms and hugged him tightly. I was so scared something had happened to you. Sophie, Dennis said in a strict voice, where have you been? We were worried about you. I'm sorry, Dad, Sophie said. I followed this mushroom trail and ate some blackberries. A mistake? Sophie would soon find out that she would regret. Sophie pointed towards a big green bush. But that doesn't look like a normal bush, Dennis thought to himself. In fact, it doesn't look like a bush at all, more like Camoscrim. He walked towards the bush and noticed some leaves. They didn't look like normal leaves, they looked fake. The look in his eyes was unfamiliar. It was a 1,000-yard stare, as Dennis remembered the war. What if there was something scary behind there? Dennis tugged and pulled at the bush. He noticed a net under all the fake leaves. It was Camoscrim, he was convinced. He pulled even harder, and it started to loosen up. One final pull, and the net fell to the ground, revealing something Dennis had never expected to find. What was it doing so far into the forest? Who hid this here without them knowing? Jake and Sophie stared at each other. They had never seen anything like this before. Can we explore, Dad? Jake said excitedly. He had a big smile on his face, unlike his sister, who looked scared at her father. This was nothing like she's ever experienced before. Could you put that there, Dad? No, Dennis answered. And I don't know who would have. It was bizarre. They found a rusty old logistics truck in the forest. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved. But time will tell if this is the last we ever hear of Dennis, Jake, Sophie, and the mysterious truck.